Hey everybody, Will from Studio Zombie 3D here. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the assembly process of the Anycubic Kobra Go. Anycubic has released this printer as part of their 7th anniversary celebration. This is a DIY printer, so there's several steps in the assembly process, but it's pretty easy if we take it step by step. Let's get right into it. Alright, first thing we're going to do is get everything unpacked. Here we have our assembly manual. Next, we have a bag with all the assembly screws and washers needed for the assembly process, as well as the sample filament. Being a DIY printer, there are several parts in the box. First up, we have our screen. This is a 2.5-inch color dial controlled screen. Here we have one of the Z-axis uprights. Next, we have the mount for the spool holder and the tube for the spool holder itself. Next up, here we have our X gantry where our hot end will sit. Underneath that, we have the top rail of the printer. Next, we have the X-axis tensioner, as well as the X-axis end stop switch. Here we have our Z-axis motor with the coupler for the Z-rod. And here we have our X-axis motor and the extruder assembly. Now, the hot end is kind of wrapped under the bed of the printer, so we'll have to remove that after we remove the base of the printer. Next, we're going to pull out the Z-axis passive block. Now we can get rid of this middle piece of foam. Next, we can go ahead and get rid of the cardboard on the four corners of the print base itself. Next, we have the other Z-axis profile. And underneath that, we have our Z-axis threaded rod. Now, be sure to remove the foam blocks from underneath the print bed, being careful not to damage any of the wire harnesses or cables underneath. Now we can get the print head out of the way here. And here we have our print head. This uses a smaller style nozzle, not like the volcano ones on the other printers. This uses a similar style print head as the Kobra, but it does not direct drive. And here we have the base of the printer with all of our electronics and the toolbox tucked underneath. Let's get this foam out of the way so we can get everything laid out on the table. Alright, let's take a look at the toolbox that was tucked underneath the base of the printer. Inside of it, you're going to find your Z-axis backlash nut, your standard power cable, here we have a short piece of Bowden for the input of the extruder. Next, we have the X-axis timing belt. Here we have our Allen wrenches used to assemble the printer, a small pair of side cutters, of course a nozzle cleaning needle. Here we have the Z-axis photoelectric switch blank, of course the standard micro USB and USB adapter, and we have our spare nozzle, and then we have our two sizes of wrenches, Here's a little packet of grease for the Z-axis threaded rod. And here we have some zip ties for just cleaning up the wiring around the printer. Alright, let's get this all laid out and we can take a look at all the pieces in the box. Here we have everything laid out on the table. It can look pretty intimidating seeing it all laid out here at once, but as long as you go step by step, it's pretty easy. The first thing we're going to start with is we're going to start by installing the Z-axis profiles onto the printer base. This is the first step in the manual, and they have a nice set of clear instructions making it nice and easy to go from step to step. First, let's get everything laid out on the table that we need for the first step. Alright, we have everything ready here for the first step. This is going to be installing the Z-axis profiles onto the printer base itself. For this step, you're going to need two M5 45 screws and two M5 25 screws, along with 4 lock washers for those screws, as well as you're going to need two M4 20 screws to attach the Z-axis motor to the Z-axis profile. Now, the easiest way to install these profiles is to have the printer base on its side. It's a good idea to have somebody give you a hand with this if you need. Now, what you're going to do is line up the Z-axis profile with the grooves on the base itself. Then you're going to take the M5 45 screw and place it in the outer hole. Once you have that tightened down, you're going to use an M5 25 screw for the inner hole, being sure to use a spring washer for both screws. And then for the other side, just simply repeat the process using the M5 45 on the outer hole and the M5 25 on the inner hole with the spring washers. Next up, we're going to go ahead and install the Z-axis motor. You'll require two M4 20 screws for this step. Be sure to have the motor nice and tight to the frame. You don't want it to move or shift at any time during printing. Next, let's go ahead and install the Anti-Backlash Nut onto the threaded Z-rod. What you're going to do is you're going to compress the Anti-Backlash Nut while threading the rod in. Now, you're only going to put this in about a third of the way. And here we have it coming out top. Be sure to have it just about a third of the way, that way the gantry will have something to rest on when you're ready to install it. Next, let's go ahead and install it on the coupler on the motor itself. Now, when you're tightening this down, you want to make sure it's good and tight. You don't want the Z-rod to move or slip at any point during printing. So go ahead and give it an extra good turn just to make sure. I always like to give it a little tug after I've installed it just to make sure it doesn't slip. Let's go ahead and get the X-axis all set up. The first thing we're going to do is install the XE axis kit. This is done with two M4 16 screws with washers. Just tighten them down onto the rail and we're good to go. And the second screw will go here through this opening. Now we can move to the opposite side and install the Z-axis passive block. For this step we're going to use one M4 16 screw and a washer. You're not going to completely tighten this down. You'll want to have a little bit of movement so when you install it onto the Z-axis profiles you can help line it up. Next, we're going to go ahead and get the hot end assembly and the timing belt installed onto the X-axis. First, we're going to get the hot end and have it to the side so we can grab it easily. Next, grab your timing belt. What we're going to do here is we're just going to lay it in the groove of the rail and wrap it around the gear of the motor. It just needs to hang here loosely while we install the hot end. Now, what you're going to do is just roll the hot end onto the rail over the belt. That'll help hold it in place while we get to the next step. Now we're going to go ahead and unassemble the X-axis tensioner. We do this just by undoing the knob on the end. The tensioner will slide out. Next, feed the timing belt through the gear and reassemble the tensioner. Once that's ready, you're going to slide it onto the end of the rail and then use two M4 16 screws, one in the front and one in the back, to attach the tensioner to the rail. And we're done. Next, we're going to attach the timing belt to the bottom of the hot end. There are two slots on the bottom of the hot end that you're going to slide the timing belts into. The brass knuckles on the end will help lock it into place. You may need to loosen tension on the tensioner if you have tightened it too much during the install. Once we have the belt locked in place, we can go ahead and install the whole X-axis onto the Z-axis profiles. Now we can go ahead and drop the X-axis assembly onto the Z-axis profile. Carefully line it up and drop it down, carefully lowering it until it comes to rest on the Z-axis anti-backlash nut. Once you have it in place, we can move on to the next step of attaching the Z-axis backlash nut to the extruder plate. Now we can go ahead and attach the Z-axis anti-backlash nut to the extruder base. You might need to rotate the backlash nut around a couple times just to get the holes to line up. And then you're going to use two M3/8 screws to attach it. Now we can go ahead and install the Photoelectric switch baffle. You're going to use two M3/5 screws for this. Just attach it and make sure it's nice and snug and we can move on to the next step. Now we're going to go ahead and install the top beam. For this step we are going to need four M5 16 screws. Just line the top beam up with the top of the Z-axis profiles and attach the four screws. While we're here, we're going to install the filament holder. You will use two M4 6 screws for this. Just make sure everything's tight and we can move on. Back around to the front of the printer, we're going to go ahead and install the screen. This requires two M416 screws. Now we're going to go ahead and install the X-axis limit switch. First, you're going to need to install the plug. Be sure to press the wire along the back into the groove and then down out through the bottom. There is a little slot provided for the wire to come through. Make sure you are going through that spot or the motor may rub on the wire. The limit switch will lock into place, but it also uses an M35 screw to hold it. We're almost at the finish line. All we have to do now is go around, make sure everything is plugged in, and then we're going to check all of our wheels and belts. All of the plugs are labeled, making it easy to make sure everything's plugged into the right location. Now we can go ahead and install the Bowden tube into the extruder. First, you're going to remove the blue clip. Next, push the Bowden tube in as far as it'll go. Once you have it in as far as it'll go, replace the blue clip to keep it from sliding out. Now we're nearing our final steps. Next, I'm going to go around and make sure all of my wheels are nice and snug. On the hot end, you're going to use the bottom wheel to adjust the concentric nut, slowly wiggling it as you tighten to make sure it grips with all three wheels and there is no looseness. And that looks pretty good, so next we can move on. I repeat the same process for all the wheels on the printer. You want to make sure everything is nice and snug. And with the Z-axis, you want to make sure all three wheels are in contact and none of them turn freely. Anycubic recommends using a block or something on the bed to help you level the printer as you adjust this. And now finally, I checked the wheels on the bed. My unit, the wheels were pretty tight and everything was really snug on the bed, so I didn't really have to adjust anything. But you want to make sure you wiggle the bed to make sure there's no looseness or play in the bed at all. And finally, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use some of the supplied zip ties to attach the wiring cables to the Bowden tube. I like to have the hot end to the far right to make sure I have enough slack in the cable. Just space them out a little bit, that way there's no chance of the cables falling or snagging on anything during any kind of printing. And then one final zip tie on the extruder mount itself. You want to make sure you have plenty of slack in the wires themselves so that there is no binding or pulling in any of the movements during printing. And here we are on the back of the printer. You're going to want to make sure that your power supply is set to the right voltage for your country. And now we can power the printer on. Anycubic has put a 2.5-inch color dial controlled screen on the Kobra Go. It has a very simple menu structure, but everything works and it's highly responsive and easy to navigate. And now the moment we've been waiting for. We're going to run through a leveling process. Once it's done, we can go ahead, load filament, and start our test print. Now that we're done leveling, let's go ahead, load some filament, and start our test print. And here we are, loading the supplied test print. You will need to adjust the Z offset on the first level as the print starts. And here we are, midway through the print. Everything's working and sounding really good. The print is coming out great using the Anycubic Silver PLA Silk. And here we are completed. For out of the box, no tuning or calibration, the print came out very clean and sharp. I'm really happy with the results and can't wait to see what this printer can do in the future. Alright everybody, that was my setup guide for the Anycubic Kobra Go. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the Studio Zombie 3D Instagram and other social media for what's going on in the studio. I'll have a lot more videos coming up shortly. Thanks for watching everybody, and take care.